Imagine the very air transforming when you enter a room. Before anyone says a word, something inside you already. You notice the slight discomfort between two people greeting each other, the tension hidden in the smile of someone trying to look good, the disguised absence in the gaze of someone pretending to be present. Some call this sensitivity, intuition, empathy. Napoleon Hill would call it spiritual perception, first sign that the mind begins to touch something beyond the surface of the world. He said there's a kind of invisible ear within us, capable of picking up frequencies. When that ear awakens, nothing is the same again, because seeing what others don't see is a point of no return. He'll believe that the human mind is a mirror of the universe, and that within each person lies a direct connection to the visible field of all ideas, emotions, truths. This is what he called the infinite mind, the place from which inspirations, intuitions, and premonitions arise. The problem is that when someone begins to access this level of perception, they also discover the denser side of existence: silent lies, polite pretenses, stifled pains. The gift of seeing clearly becomes a burden, but once seemed a blessing. Hill warned, he who awakens too soon walks alone among those still sleep. Consciousness waits for no one. It simply opens its eyes, and the world suddenly seems too small to accommodate so much lucidity. There's a moment, perhaps you've felt this before, when the truth comes not as a revelation, as a discomfort. An internal noise that says, something isn't right here. It's a perception that doesn't ask for permission, doesn't give warning, it simply arises. And no matter how hard you try to ignore it, it remains. Napoleon Hill said this is the beginning of creative thinking, the friction between what is and what could be. But there's one detail he always emphasized: the power to perceive is also the power to suffer. Seeing what is hidden is inevitably seeing how much human beings hide from themselves. It's like turning on a light in a dusty room. Suddenly, everything that was invisible becomes evident, and this vision comes at how many times have you entered a conversation and realized no one was really saying what they felt? Everyone speaks, but the words float empty, without roots. There's a kind of collective agreement to maintain the illusion, keep everything light, pleasant, predictable. But for those who see the invisible, this social theater sounds deafening. Napoleon Hill said that most people live in mental hypnosis, conditioned by habits and repeated beliefs that keep the system in balance. But those who see through this feel the imbalance. They feel the weight of lies told, smiles, of kindnesses used, and suddenly they can no longer participate in this game without deep discomfort. The awakened mind notices the cracks. It notices the wife who elegantly disguises her fear, the friend who laughs while emptying himself inside, the boss who preaches motivation but lives for appearances. Hill would say these are minds in dissonance, vibrating far from inner harmony. When you see this, when you perceive the pain of others even in silence, something changes within you, because you can no longer unsee it. Conscience is a mirror that once cleansed, never tarnished. And this is where the gift begins to be. Hill believed that every thought is a seed. What you observe, what you perceive, what you feel, it all becomes mental matter within you. When this perception becomes too intense, it begins to alter the way you see the world. Conversations lose their superficial luster. Places seem charged with invisible stories, and even silence gains density. You begin to notice what others avoid noticing, the contradiction between what they say and feel, between what they show and hide. This creates a kind of separation, not physical, but vibrational. You're still among people, but something within you no longer fully belongs to that same plane. And yet Hill never saw this as a tragedy. For him, it was a stage of spiritual growth, the beginning of true self-mastery. He said that all power arises from understanding the invisible laws that govern the visible. In other words, those who see beyond the surface begin to understand the game of life. But understanding the game doesn't mean being able to play it lightly, because while everyone follows the social rules, smiling, agreeing, avoiding conflict, the awakened feel the internal friction of those who see the whole board. What to do with this awareness? Pretend not to see? Or risk being misunderstood for saying so? This is the dilemma that marks the beginning of every journey. The world rewards conformity, not lucidity. Hill knew this. He himself was ridiculed for speaking of mental laws when the world believed only in matter. They called him a dreamer, a mystic, a deluded man. But he persisted because he understood that truth needs no approval. The men who see furthest are those who bear the burden of seeing first. And perhaps this is the fate of those who feel too much, to endure clarity until it transforms into wisdom. There's a moment when perception ceases to be a choice. You no longer decide whether to watch or not, you just see. Hill said that the mind, once expanded by a new idea, never returns to its original size. And the same is true of the soul. Once it awakens to truth, There's no returning to innocence. Ignorance is comfortable, but those who have tasted consciousness are never satisfied. This is the paradox of the awakened. They want to belong. They want to rest. They no longer sleep. You begin to understand that the world was built on subtle agreements to avoid pain, to disguise vulnerability, to keep the social flow intact. But Napoleon Hill saw these agreements as the golden shackles of the human mind, invisible chains that keep man prisoner to his own comfort zone. Breaking them is painful, but necessary, because according to him, true success and inner success is only possible for those who face their own illusion. And the first illusion to fall is that of appearance. Lucidity, therefore, is not it is a sacred burden. It requires courage to observe the world without anesthesia, to face falsehood without hatred, pain without despair. Hill said that the higher mind learns to see chaos and still remain calm, because it understands that each dissonance is just part of a larger process. But until reaching this point, awakening is a kind of purification. It burns away illusions like fire that refines gold. Have you ever wondered why some people seem to feel the world more deeply? Why do certain gazes carry a kind of silent melancholy, as if they see something others don't? Hill would answer, because they have already touched reality without a veil. And once the veil falls, there is no replacing it. This is the price of consciousness, possibility of sleep. The world continues its theater. The lights come on, the laughter echoes. But those who see the invisible already know everything. There is just scenery. And yet, within this painful perception, a calling to understand, not to condemn. Hill said that the truly wise person doesn't use their vision to judge, but to transform their own vibration. They understand that seeing the darkness is not the same as fighting it. Sometimes, all it takes is to keep the light burning within. This is the beginning of the point at which perception ceases to be mere observation and becomes responsibility. The moment when awakening begins to require wisdom to avoid becoming suffering. Napoleon Hill knew that the awakened mind must learn to protect itself, maintain its high frequency, even when surrounded by noise. He called this spiritual self-discipline, the ability to remain clear amidst chaos. Because, as he said, the victory of the mind is the victory over the illusions of the world. And it is here, on this threshold between seeing and understanding, that the journey truly begins. When consciousness touches truth for the first time, the heart feels fear, but the soul recognizes the path. It is the birth of lucidity, a dangerous gift, a demanding gift, a force that both elevates and wounds. And those who accept this call must be ready for the silence that comes after. The silence of those who see what others cannot, choose to keep. There's something strange about how the world has learned to live with lies. Not the big lie, political or philosophical, but the small one, the one that repeats itself in daily gestures, automatic responses, in conversations where everyone pretends to be at ease. Napoleon Hill called this phenomenon the social illusion of harmony. He said that people prefer a false peace to an uncomfortable truth because the human mind seeks above all else the preservation of its own comfort. That's why, when someone enters a room and sees what's hidden, mood changes. There's a subtle discomfort, an invisible tremor in the air. The presence of someone who sees clearly disturbs the artificial balance everyone strives to maintain. Hill compared social life to a grand performance. Each person dons a carefully crafted mask to fit the role they believe they need to play. Confident professional, cheerful friend, the devoted companion. The play is long, and the applause is constant, as long as no one forgets the script. The problem is that there's always someone who silently notices the crack in the mask, the averted gaze, the overly restrained gesture. And that's when the play begins to unravel. Have you ever felt it? That moment when you walk into a room and realize something isn't being said to everyone. Hill said, this realization is the first sign of an awakened mind. Consciousness perceives the dissonance between what is and what appears to be, and is incapable of pretending not to notice. Hill once recounted a business meeting where everyone was praising each other. It was one of those situations where the appearance of success was more important than the actual outcome. He watched silently as each participant reinforced the collective charade until he noticed something subtle. One of the men wasn't smiling with his eyes. It was a practiced, rigid, almost pained smile. Hill realized that this man carried enormous anguish, a sense of failure that he tried to hide with words of enthusiasm. Mind lies, but the eyes betray the truth, he say. He didn't need to hear it. And the curious thing is that at the end of the meeting, the same man came to him alone, for advice on how to start over. It was as if he sensed that Hill saw beyond appearances. This kind of sensitivity, however, comes at a high price, because those who see too much end up becoming a mirror, and people in general don't like to see themselves clearly. They want to be perceived comfortably within the role they've constructed. Hill said that the human soul fears being revealed more than it fears being judged. That's why the presence of someone lucid, even silent, can cause discomfort. There's no need to say anything, just be there. The clarity of someone who observes without being deceived breaks the collective disguise, and the group reacts instinctively, sometimes with distance, sometimes with irony, sometimes with that indefinable feeling that something about him bothers. Have you ever noticed this happen? Maybe at a dinner party when someone tries to force a joy they don't feel, and your closer look is all it takes for the mask to start slipping. Or maybe at work, when everyone pretends everything is fine, but you feel the tension in the air, like an invisible electric current. It's a skill you don't choose, it simply exists. And once awakened, it can't be turned off. Hill said that expanded awareness is like a lighthouse that doesn't know where to hide in the fog, because shining attracts attention, and attention awakens resistance. The curious thing is that the world itself seems to conspire to maintain the illusion. Society has created an invisible code. You shouldn't see too much, shouldn't feel too much. People say everything's fine even when it's not, and expect you to accept that answer. It's a silent pact of, and in a way, it's understandable. Daily life would be unbearable if everyone revealed everything they feel all the time. But those with an awakened gaze live on the edge of this. They see the truth, but they have to pretend not to see it to avoid upsetting the balance. It's an exhausting dance, constant effort to avoid being the mirror that reflects to. Hill described this as the prison of perception. The mind perceives more than it should, and therefore suffers. Because while everyone floats on the surface of appearances, the lucid person feels the weight of what is submerged. He sees hidden motivations, disguised fears, the voids no one wants to name. And the more he sees, the more he distances him. The crowd follows the dance, observes from the outside, unable to participate without losing something of him. The paradox is cruel. The more awareness, the more solitude. Hill saw this solitude as part of the maturation process of higher mind. Clarity removes, but prepares. It removes noise, illusions, fragile attachments. It prepares the spirit to understand what is essential. He once mentioned a curious incident. A young man came to him saying he felt out of place, that he seemed to see intentions no one else did. Like I'm going crazy. Hill smiled and replied, "It's not madness, perception. But be careful. The mind that sees beyond must learn to remain silent until it understands what it sees." This phrase became one of the most repeated among his readers because it sums up the central dilemma of the seeing too much and still maintaining serenity. The truth is, the world isn't ready for those who see deeply. They prefer the shine of the surface. Anyone who reveals what's behind the curtain is seen as a threat, someone who disrupts the harmony. And perhaps that's why so many try to hide their lucidity, pretend they didn't notice, laugh along, agree with the obvious, avoid direct gaze. This attempt is futile. The gaze trained by consciousness doesn't shut down. It captures what I try to erase. It's the gaze that penetrates the disguise and reaches what Hill called the true vibration, the frequency where no mask can hold. There are also moments when this perception becomes almost supernatural. You sense a presence before you see. Sense what someone will say before they say it. Hill argued that the developed mind picks up signals from the collective tiny waves that it's the secret language of energy, and everyone emits it, even if they don't realize. This is why the sensitive suffers. They hear what no one says, and there's no way to unhear, but not all. There's also a quiet beauty. Hill believed that seeing the invisible is participating in a broader truth, where every human emotion reveals itself as part of the same web. The sadness of a stranger, the irritation of a colleague, the unexpected kindness of someone you barely know, they all connect. When you begin to perceive this web, you understand that people lie not just out of malice, but out of fear. Fear of not being accepted, fear of breaking, fear of not being able to bear their own reflection. And then, something inside you softens. Compassion begins to emerge in place of judgment. Hill said that true awakening is not seeing the lie, but understanding why it exists. He believed that when you understand human frailty, your heart stops reacting with anger and starts reacting with wisdom. His clarity, when it matures, stops being an accusation and becomes understanding. But this learning process is slow and at times lonely. Until that point is reached, the path is fraught with tension between the desire to shout what you see and the need to remain silent to avoid being thrown out of the theater. And so life goes on, with the world acting and the observer. He laughs when everyone laughs, but his laughter comes from elsewhere. It comes from the awareness that the scene is fleeting, that the truth will always find a way to emerge, sooner or later. Hill said that illusion has a deadline, but truth is eternal. And it is this certainty that keeps the observer standing, even when he feels isolated. Because deep down he knows, stage may change, masks may fall, but the alert gaze. In the end, there is neither anger nor contempt, only a kind of serenity born of understanding. Seeing the theater of humanity doesn't mean abandoning the stage, but understanding one's role in it. And perhaps this is the first step toward true freedom, realizing that one doesn't need to destroy the illusion to transcend it. One simply needs to see it clearly, with the kind of gaze Napoleon Hill described as the silent light of those who awaken too soon. There's kind of silence that only those who see too much, not the silence of ordinary solitude, but that of someone forced to keep what they perceive. Napoleon Hill used to say that the mind that wakes too soon carries the burden of seeing too soon. And this burden isn't just emotional, it's existential. Those who begin to see the invisible movements of life, the games disguised as kindness, and the intentions hidden in the most banal gesture, discover that the price of lucidity is distance. The gaze that perceives too much becomes uncomfortable. People don't run away from you. They run away from themselves, reflected in your presence. And little by little, you learn that consciousness is also isolation. Hill said that every human being carries a mental frequency field, vibratory zone, that communicates what words cannot. When two people meet, they communicate not just with words, energy. This is why the lucid person feels what is said. The sadness that hangs heavy in the air, the fear that disguises itself as arrogance, the resentment masked by cordiality. They perceive disharmony, and even in silence, their mere presence causes discomfort. It's as if the environment reacts to the light they carry. Those who live by appearances feel exposed before someone who doesn't believe. Hill explained that this reaction is natural. Truth doesn't hurt, it only illuminates. What hurts is the effort to remain in the darkness. But what happens when this perception becomes permanent? When it's no longer possible to ignore what one sees? The observer begins to feel like a stranger among them. Conversations lose their charm, superficial relationships become unbearable. They try to adapt, but every attempt to disguise their own discernment corrodes them from. It's the birth of a deeper loneliness, not the absence of companionship, absence of understanding. A person feels they speak a language no one else understands, so they begin to fall silent. Silence, once a choice, becomes a shelter. Hill called this process vibrational withdrawal, the moment when the conscious being withdraws to avoid being torn apart by the noise of the world. What if this solitude isn't a punishment but a necessary stage? What if it's the bridge between insight and wisdom? Hill once told of a woman who possessed an extraordinary sensitivity. He called her the soul reader. She could sense people's intentions with frightening precision. One look was enough to tell who was being sincere and who was just. At first, everyone was captivated by her intuition. But over time, they began to avoid her. Too intense, they said. You interpret everything. You seem to analyze me all the. What she didn't know was that her gaze penetrated beyond her mask, and few can bear to be seen without it. Hill observed this with the serenity of someone who already knew the cycle. People love the truth until it begins to move within them. And when that happens, they react by trying to silence the messenger. This is the point where the gift becomes a dilemma. The same gaze that illuminates also wounds. The awakened mind sees the contradictions of others, also its own. You begin to realize how much you still live in expectations, how much you try to save, correct, understand too much. Hill asserted that consciousness, before liberating, reveals its bonds, and each bond undone is a part of the ego that the awakened person discovers discomfort, but they too wore masks. It's only more subtle. External clarity forces introspection, and the mirror that once revealed the world begins to reflect oneself. Have you ever felt this? That strange mixture of lucidity and exhaustion, of understanding everything and at the same time wishing to understand nothing? It's at this point that many give up. They seek subtle anesthesia distractions, promises, romances, anything that restores a sense of belonging. But the awakened mind doesn't fall asleep isolated. It observes even its own fatigue. Hill said that self-knowledge is a process of no return, and that those who have seen the truth cannot hide from the light without losing themselves. Therefore, the path of lucidity is not one of escape, but of assimilation, learning to remain conscious without drowning in what they perceive. This requires a new skill, mastery of one's own vibration. Hill compared this mastery to controlling a flame. If the flame is too strong, it consumes. If it's too weak, it goes out. Balance is keeping the fire burning without burning oneself. To achieve this, the lucid person needs to develop the art of discernment, knowing what is theirs and what belongs to the other, what should be absorbed, and what should be returned to the universe. They learn to observe without reacting, to feel without burdening. They discover that true empathy is not suffering with the other, but remaining present without self in them. How can you continue to love the world after seeing it naked? This is the question that separates the initiate from the sage. The initiate still resents seeing too much. The sage has learned to transform the burden of vision into passion. Hill said that spiritual maturity begins when you stop condemning the sleep of others and decide to take charge of your own. Wakefulness. From that point on, perception ceases to be a curse and becomes a beacon. The observer no longer tries to wake anyone, he simply stays awake. And his silent serenity ends up, paradoxically, awakening those who are ready. There is, however, a detail that Hill rarely mentioned, but which is revealed in his most intimate writings. Clarity can also become ill. When the mind sees too much without understanding what it sees, it fragments. This is what he called a crisis of discernment. The person begins to doubt their own sanity. Why do I feel what others don't? Why do I perceive what no one else notices? It is a dark period in which lucidity seems like punishment, but it is also the threshold of transformation. If the individual endures discomfort without denying what they perceive, something reorganizes within them. Perception, previously chaotic, becomes correction. They cease to be a victim of their own sensitivity and become its guardian. Have you ever noticed how pain changes in nature starts to make sense? He'll believe this was the true spiritual rebirth, the moment when a human being understands that they are not in this world to good, but to comprehend. That clarity is not a tool of control, but rather an invitation to surrender. The observer then stops seeking solace and begins seeking purpose. Their solitude gains meaning. They understand that they were set apart to serve as a bridge between ignorance and awakening, between fear and faith, between chaos and understanding. And when this understanding matures, something surprising happens. That silence that once hurt begins to take on a new texture. It's no longer emptiness, space. A space where the mind can breathe, where the soul rests from the effort of explaining itself. Hill said, "This is the moment when the conscious mind meets the serene heart, the point in which knowledge transforms into the observer learns to be among people without losing center. He hears the lies without anger, witnesses the illusions without despair, and understands that everything is part of the same theater of learning." And then, for the first time, the lucid man smiles again. Not the automatic smile of masks, but a calm, almost imperceptible smile. He smiles because he finally understands that the world doesn't need to be fixed to be understood. That truth doesn't require an audience presence. That the loneliness of those who see too much, punishment, but training for a rare kind of love, one that sees everything and still chooses to remain. Napoleon Hill used to say that the most dangerous moment of consciousness is when a person realizes they can no longer pretend not. This is when truth ceases to be a choice and becomes condemnation. He recounted that once, during a lecture on mental self-mastery, one of the listeners stood up and asked, "Mr. Hill, what happens when we see something wrong, but no one wants to see it?" Hill remained silent for a few seconds, then replied, "You carry two crosses, that of speaking and being rejected, or that of remaining silent and being destroyed from within." This answer echoed among those present like a sentence. It summed up a duality that everyone experiences but few understand, a struggle between the instinct to preserve peace and the need to remain true to one's own perception. Anyone who has experienced this knows it's not a simple choice. When you decide to speak out, the world body invaded. People defend themselves, attack, and dismiss. Hill said the collective mind is programmed to protect its illusion. Any attempt to expose them generates immediate resistance. It's the same in a group of friends, in a company, in a family. If someone dares to question the dominant narrative, they automatically become the problem. Lucidity is mistaken for negativity, sincerity for aggression, clarity for arrogance. Hill noted in one of his diaries, "Society persecutes the lucid because he threatens the equilibrium of shared ignorance." He knew this from personal experience. In 1935, during the Great Depression, he tried to warn business people that fear was becoming more destructive than the economic crisis itself. He was ridiculed. Months later, many of those same men lost everything. Some returned for advice. But what if you choose silence? What if you decide not to speak to preserve the bond, the job, the apparent harmony? Hill warned that this path also exacts its price. Every time we deny our own vision, the soul splits in two. The first continues to see, the second learns to pretend not to see. It's an invisible but fatal split. The mind begins to doubt its own perception. Intuition, once clear, becomes confused. Gradually, the individual loses confidence in themselves. They adapt, but pay with their own authenticity. This is what Hill called the silent suicide of consciousness. This condition, curiously, more common than one might think. Modern studies in social psychology confirm something Hill already intuited 100 years ago. Human beings have an instinctive fear of being the only one to disagree. In 1951, researcher Solomon Asch demonstrated this in a famous experiment. He placed 8 people in a room, 7 of whom were actors. He showed them lines of different sizes and asked them to identify which was the longest. Even when the correct answer was obvious, the actors gave the wrong one. The 8th participant, who was unaware of the trick, ended up agreeing with them 75% of the time. He would rather be wrong with the group than right alone. Had Hill witnessed this experiment, he would have said, "That's why progress is so slow. The truth must first conquer the fear of those who see it." There's something almost cruel about this mechanism. When you dare to see and express what you see, the system reacts like an immune system, tries to expel you. Criticism comes disguised as concern. You're too sensitive. You don't need to exaggerate. You're seeing things where they don't exist. The language changes, but the intention is the same. to discredit your perception. Hill argued that this is one of the collective unconscious's most sophisticated defenses. If the group convinces the observer that they are wrong, the illusion remains intact. Shooting the messenger. Messenger of truth has never experienced this countless times. One of his students during a leadership class stated that he wanted to learn how to manipulate people. Hill responded coldly, "Manipulation is the act of using vision to dominate, not to serve. And all power born of control dies with fear." The student was not pleased. He spread rumors that Hill was too mystical, disconnected from reality. Months later, the same man lost the position he so valued, a victim of the very game he believed. Hill recorded the episode with an intriguing observation. Truth needs no revenge. It only waits for time to reveal the blind. But the tension between speaking and remaining silent remains the greatest dilemma for those. It's the kind of choice with no easy exit. On one side, isolation. On the other, self-denial. The world offers applause to those who agree, but icy silence to those who question. It's been this way forever. Prophets were stoned, scientists ridiculed, artists censored. Hill saw this as an inevitable pattern of human evolution. Society progresses by pushing visionaries to the margins and then rebuilding the center where they stood. He wrote, "It's one of history's most profound ironies. The same world that rejects the lucid ends up following them when the fog lifts. Have you ever noticed how the truth takes a while to be accepted, but when it arrives, everyone pretends they've always known it?" There's a little-known anecdote by Hill that illustrates this paradox perfectly. In 1928, he met a man named Charles, the owner of a small tool factory. Charles had a nagging intuition that he should invest in lightweight materials, still experimental at the time. The other businessmen laughed. "The market wants weight, robustness, not aluminum toys," they said. Hill encouraged him to trust his instincts. Years later, aluminum became industry standard, and Charles's company prospered. Interestingly, when success arrived, the same colleagues who mocked him began to say they had always believed in the idea. Hill commented on the anecdote in a lecture, concluding, "Clarity is lonely until it's profitable, but not all stories end happily. There are also the silent tragedies of those who can't stand the pressure of validity." Hill cited the case of a teacher who saw her students' emotional deterioration before any other adult noticed. She tried to alert the administration, but was accused of overreacting. Symptoms were confirmed months later when one of the students collapsed. She was too right to be heard, Hill. And the world doesn't forgive those who reveal too soon what they don't yet want. This dynamic is universal. What changes are the scenarios. In the workplace, the lucid person is labeled a pessimist. In the family, a rebel. In relationships, a cold or difficult person. The problem isn't what they say. Seeing the truth forces others to confront their own shadows, and few are ready for that. Hill described this phenomenon as the mirror of conscience. Every time you reflect someone's truth, you awaken both fascination and fear. And what if the real challenge isn't whether to speak or remain silent, but learning to choose when? Hill believed there is a right time for every revelation. He said that wisdom is truth in silence, waiting for receptivity. Talking too much is wasting energy. Remaining silent is stifling the spirit. Balance lies in discerning when the mind is ready to listen. Yours and others. He compared it to farming. No one plants a seed in the cold. Consciousness must find fertile soil to germinate. Sometimes that soil is time. But until that time arrives, the lucid person must endure discomfort. It's inevitable. They will become the target of criticism, misunderstanding, and loneliness. Hill saw this as a spiritual test. God tests the messenger of truth with the silence of the world. It is in this silence that strength is formed. The individual learns to trust their own intuition more than the approval of others. They learn that speaking the truth is not about imposing a vision, but about remaining true to it, even if no one believes it. Some say this is too much of a burden for one man. Perhaps it is. But Hill believed that every awakened mind, no matter how small, helps push humanity one step forward. He called these individuals the invisible guardians of progress. They are few and rarely recognized, but they silently sustain the fabric of. They are the ones who, even when wounded, continue to choose truth over expediency. Perhaps this is what defines true courage, not facing external danger, but enduring the internal incomprehension of one's time. Hill said that the price of sight is the incomprehension of the blind, but he added a hope. Every age of darkness ends when someone decides to keep seeing. And it is this act, the simple act of keeping seeing, that keeps the light the world tries to extinguish burning. Because in the end, truth doesn't need spoken to exist. It only takes someone in silence. Napoleon Hill said that the most silent danger of consciousness lies not in seeing too much, but in feeling everything at once. This is when the awakened mind becomes like an open antenna, capturing emotions, thoughts, and vibrations that don't belong to it. The lucid person enters a room and leaves exhausted without understanding. They capture other people's fear, anxiety, and pent-up anger. They don't observe the world, they absorb it. And this sensitivity, which at first seemed like a gift, begins to transform into a Hill called this the burden of untrained empathy, a state of someone who feels without filtering, of someone who carries invisible weights that aren't. He believed that every human mind is an energy field, and that thoughts circulate between people like radio waves. The problem arises when the observer, wanting to understand or help, tunes into too many frequencies. It's as if the heart loses its boundaries. Gradually, what was compassion becomes confusion. The individual no longer knows what they truly feel. Sadness arrives without irritation appears without cause. Fatigue sets in even after rest. Hill described this as the dissolution of the self, the moment when the mind loses its shape and merges with everything it perceives. Some people think this is an negation, but it's a real phenomenon. Recent neuroscience studies show that the human brain mirrors other people's emotions through mirror neurons. Feeling another person's pain is literal. The body reacts as if it were its own. Hill, unaware of modern science, already sensed this. He said that vibration knows no distance, and every emotion is an invitation to enter. The danger, he said, lies in accepting too many invitations. But there's something deeper behind this. Sensitivity increases, so does the desire to heal what is perceived. The lucid person cannot bear to see suffering without trying to alleviate. They try to help, advise, protect. Hill warned that this is the most subtle trap. Those who feel too much believe they must save everyone. And in trying to save everyone, they end up drowning. He told the story of a friend named Jonathan, a businessman with an extraordinary perception of people. Jonathan could tell when someone was lying, when they were feigning enthusiasm, when they were hiding anguish. He used this to motivate and inspire others until he began to absorb everyone's dramas. Within a few years, he was exhausted, drained of energy, unable to distinguish his own voice from the chorus of others' pain. Hill described him as a man who listened to the whole world and forgot to listen. Have you ever felt this? That feeling of carrying problems that aren't yours, of trying to solve pains that no one asked to. It is at this point that empathy ceases to be a virtue, becomes a trap. Hill compared this state to diving into a murky river and trying to clean it with your hand. The more you try to clarify the water, the more you stir it, dirtier it becomes. He said clarity is born not of effort, but of stillness. The river only becomes clear when the current calms. The same is true of the mind. The real challenge is not to feel less, but to feel. One night, Hill reported dreaming of a pool of water. In it, he saw the reflection of all the people he tried to help. Each one asked him for something: attention, strength, salvation. And as he reached out, he realized the mirror was shattering, taking a piece of himself with each touch. He woke with a phrase in his mind: "It is not my duty to heal the world. It is my duty not to let myself be sickened by it." Then, he has taught that the awakened mind must learn to observe without possessing, to understand without absorbing. True compassion, he said, is love that does not invade. But there comes a point where the burden of perception reaches its limit. The lucid person begins to doubt their own health. They wonder if they've gone mad, if they're imagining too much. The problem lies within them. This is the most dangerous moment, the borderline between lucidity and collapse. Hill asserted that the mind that feels without direction can become a prisoner of its own gift. The secret, according to him, is to transform feeling into a tool of wisdom, not a source of suffering. To do this, the person must regain the separation between what is theirs and what is not. How do you do this when everything seems connected, when the world's pains knock on your door as if they were your own? Hill taught a simple, almost spiritual exercise. When feeling someone's emotional weight, he imagined himself surrounded by a sphere of golden light, not to isolate himself, but to remind himself, "I can understand without carrying." It was a practice of invisible boundaries, a reminder that true love is not absorption, it is presence. However, fate always tests the lucid. He told of a young woman named Evelyn, a student of his, who worked with families in crisis. She possessed such profound intuition that she could sense when a couple could still reconcile, or when the bond was irreparably broken. At first, her sensitivity made her shine. Then she began to fall. She spent sleepless nights thinking about other people's plights. She cried over pain that wasn't hers. Hill, upon visiting her, said something she never forgot. "Evelyn, what you call empathy is a disguised form of pride. You believe you need to feel everything to prove you're good. But true kindness doesn't need to suffer together, only to understand and act." That sentence transformed her. Evelyn learned to set boundaries without losing her tenderness. She discovered that calm was more healing than distressed compassion. Hill wrote of her years later, "The light that does not flicker shines brighter than the flame that consumes itself." Have you ever noticed how the world seems to demand that the sensitive sacrifice themselves to be accepted? That sweetness is only valued when it hurts? Hill denounced this as a moral distortion. True strength, he says, is remaining whole amidst chaos. It is observing suffering and still maintaining balance. The awakened mind, when it matures, understands that it came not to dissolve, but to hold the space where others can safely see themselves. It is at this point that tension turns into revelation. The gift of feeling is not a burden, compass. The pain of others is not a weight, it is a sign. But only the wise can interpret it without swallowed up. Hill said that the awakened heart does not need to suffer to love, only to remain lucid. And when a person learns this, something changes. They begin to walk among those who sleep without feeling the same weariness. They learn to breathe deeply before reacting, to wait for the right time before acting, to let their own calm become a help. It is then that the world, once so heavy, other people's emotions remain, but they no longer invade. The observer feels, understands, and he discovers that borderless empathy is not love, fusion. And that true love is the kind that embraces without dissolving. Hill said that, at this stage, consciousness reaches its maximum purity, the point at which compassion and lucidity unite. This is when the sensitive becomes wise. And in the end, after so many emotional storms, the lucid one finally understands the secret Hill kept in all his lessons. Seeing is not saving. Feeling is not suffering. Understanding is not carrying. The role of the awakened one is not to extinguish the world's fire, but to learn to shine without burning, because only then can they truly. There's a moment when silence transforms into understanding. Napoleon Hill said that the awakened mind, facing the pain of lucidity, the weight of empathy, reaches a point where it no longer needs to fight what it sees, learns to simply be. This is the moment when truth ceases to be a wound and becomes a landscape. What once hurt now teaches. What once isolated now frees. The consciousness that once sought to fix the world begins to realize that inner peace itself is the greatest form of transformation. Hill called this the quiet power, the state in which the mind masters chaos not through resistance, but through serenity. It's when you understand that nothing needs to be forced, because everything true is already in the process of coming to light. He believed that living with open eyes doesn't mean carrying the weight of the world, but walking within it with wisdom. A lucid person isn't one who sees more, but one who sees with purpose. After overcoming fear, judgment, loneliness, and oversensitivity, comes the final lesson, transforming perception into presence. The awakened mind no longer tries to change people. It learns to inspire them simply by existing authentically. And this is something anyone can practice. It starts with small actions, observing before reacting, breathing before responding, feeling without becoming. Hill said that the mind that dominates the moment dominates destiny. Each moment of awareness, the seed planted in the soil of reality. But there's something deeper he always wanted. Clarity alone isn't enough. True power arises when clarity meets love. Seeing without loving hardens. Loving without seeing blinds. Only the union of the two awakens wisdom. That's why wise people seem calm. Not because they see less, because they've learned to see with their heart. He'll believe this balance is the highest form of human intelligence, and it's accessible to all who decide to look within before looking outward. Life doesn't ask you to be perfect, just aware. It doesn't require you to save anyone, just that you don't lose yourself trying. In his lectures, Hill told a simple but powerful story. A man was walking through a foggy city. He complained that he couldn't see his way, until, tired, he sat down and noticed a lamp burning in a window. It wasn't a large light, constant. He understood then that all he had to do was follow that small glow until day. That light is consciousness. As long as it shines, never totally lost. The metaphor is accurate. You don't need to see everything, enough to take the next step. This is the essence of lucid living, walking with faith, even when there are no guarantees, trusting that truth reveals itself to those who remain awake. But how can we apply all this in such a fast-paced and noisy world? Hill recommended 3 simple, almost invisible practices, which he called habits of the awakened mind. The first is conscious pause. Before reacting to any situation, breathe and ask yourself, does this really belong to me? This question alone can prevent countless burnouts. Second is non-judgmental. When you notice something in someone, flaw, a contradiction, fear, just try to understand without the need to correct. The simple act of observing with empathy is already a form of healing. The third practice is intentional withdrawal. Hill said that the external world is too noisy for those learning to listen to their own spirit. Setting aside a few minutes of silence daily is like cleaning the mirror. It is in this space that intuition strengthens, answers appear. These actions may seem small, but they are revolutionary. Modern humans believe that transformation requires grand gestures, but Hill proved that it begins with the most subtle choices. The tone of voice, the way you look, the silence before speaking. Every conscious act alters the collective mental field. When you choose to react with calm instead of anger, the world around you changes. Not immediately, but inevitably. The quiet mind, he said, is the most powerful force in the universe because it creates without hurting. He also taught that the solitude of the lucid is only temporary. Sooner or later, you will find others who see as you. People who are not frightened by the truth, who do not need to ask to safe. And when this happens, something extraordinary happens. Silent recognition. It is as if two lights meet on the same frequency. For an instant, the whole world becomes clearer. Hill believed that this union of the conscious is the beginning of a new era, a humanity guided not by fear, but by compassionate lucidity. However, he always warned, being awakened is not being superior. Lucidity is not a trophy, it is a responsibility. It requires you to live with humility and discernment, remembering that each person is at the exact level of consciousness they can bear. Forcing someone to awaken, like opening someone's eyes in the middle of a deep dream, doesn't generate understanding, only pain. Therefore, Hill advised, be an example, not an imposition. What truly awakens others are not words, but presence, the calm gaze, the silent kindness, the unshakable balance. When you become this, you don't need to convince anyone. Your own peace becomes the argument. And at the end of it all, Hill left a lesson that seemed simple, but was the most profound of all. Life is a constant training in learning to remain in the light, even when everything around grows dark. This is the true test of the awakened mind. It's not seeing angels or predicting the future, but maintaining serenity amidst chaos. It's remembering, even on difficult days, that every emotion is fleeting. Every pain is a teacher, and every failure is part of the soul's maturation process. Consciousness doesn't promise comfort, it promises meaning. And it is meaning that makes suffering bearable. Maybe this is what you need to hear today. Nothing wrong with feeling too much, seeing too much, caring too much. A mistake would be giving up on feeling, seeing, and caring. Use what you see to understand, not use what you feel to strengthen, not to consume. Use what you learn to build, not to control. Awareness is not a shield against pain. It is the ability to move through it without losing your humanity. So if any part of this story spoke to you, perhaps it's because your own consciousness is calling for more clarity, more lightness, more authenticity. Allow yourself this step. Start now. Observe yourself, breathe, be silent for a few minutes, and feel how revolutionary calm can be. Hill used to close his lectures by saying, the world awakens, a single individual chooses to remain awake. Perhaps that individual could be you. If this message touched something within you, leave a comment, even if it's anonymous. Share your feelings. And if you want to continue this journey of clarity, reflection, and growth, subscribe to the channel and like the video. Your presence here is no coincidence, a sign that in some way, you too have begun to see what others don't.